essentially what we're trying to do is find a way to release people from lockdown, but at scale, keep track of outbreaks of infection and the kind of circles of infection around the initially detected person. And we want to do that with technology, and we're doing it broadly, globally. The current plan is to do it with smartphone apps, and for those apps to use some combination of location data and something called Bluetooth beaconing, which is basically where your phone picks up all the phones around it, and each of those phones has a unique identifier, and so it knows which phones it's been near. And then at some point, if somebody is reported as having coronavirus and they upload their phone's identifier, I'm very much simplifying here, your phone can work out that it's seen that identifier and therefore you must have been near them, and so you're at infection risk. And there are a whole bunch of issues here. The first is that this kind of thing only works if you have mass adoption. You need about 60% of the population to have the app and use it for it to work. But everyone is suggesting that we're going to do this on the basis of consent. And this is, both a technical point about GDPR in terms of what's the justification for using health data in this way or location data in this way. But it's also a question of approach. If we're saying to people, please download this app because you're helping us, there comes a point where the strength of the plea makes it unlikely that people are really consenting. They're doing it because they're being told to. It's just not necessarily legally mandated. And I'm very uncomfortable about that because it goes against the principle of how consent is supposed to work. And I think we should be honest and say, look, if everybody has to download this thing, then everybody has to download this thing, and we should mandate it. That, whether it's done by consent or it's done by legal obligation, we then have this issue about all the data that we're collecting. We know where everybody is all the time. We know who they're meeting, and you can see how tempting that data will be to people other than epidemiologists. So, this is something that the security services has wanted forever. If you could track an extremist and everybody they've met forever, you can see why you wouldn't really want to give that up. And it's useful for traffic planning, and it's useful for identifying immigrants. And there's endless horrible, increasingly dystopian use cases for that kind of data. And one of the things that's disturbing, and we'll come back to exactly why it's so disturbing in the long-term risks, is that the UK particularly has chosen to centralize the database of people's contacts, where everybody in Europe is trying to keep it local on the phone, so that ultimately the individual rather than government has control of that matching process. The stigma risk goes a bit beyond that. So if you think about how these apps work, you get an alert that says you have been in contact with somebody who has been identified as having coronavirus. You're then expected both to report this so that your contacts can be traced, and also to isolate yourself. As a consequence, for a start, the person at the center of that little ripple is in danger of having fingers pointed at them, because the consequence for everybody they've been in contact with is that they have to stop working for 2 weeks and may not get paid, particularly if they're self-employed. And the more that ripples out, the more you can see that there's a potential stigmatization of somebody who did anything you can identify as risky behavior that led to them becoming the source of a localized lockdown. The other thing is the danger that people start asking to see your phone so that you can prove that you haven't had a match. So that you can say, look, I haven't been near anybody who, I should have a prop here, where it is. Look, I haven't had any contact with infected people, so I'm clean. And that's, both from a privacy perspective horrific, but also from a civil liberties perspective. How many people are ultimately going to decide that they have the right to demand to see your, COVID-free status, or your implied COVID-free status?